Almost 50 years ago, a story called A Fragment Out of Time was released, written by Diane Marchant. It was published in a popular fanzine called Grupp and featured a, let's just say, scandalous encounter between two men. Those men? Captain James T. Kirk and Officer Spock of Star Trek, the original series. The first line of the story reads, "Shut up, we're by no means setting a precedent." But little did Marchant know that by creating the first widely published slash fic, she'd be setting into motion a huge precedent for fandom, desired queer relationships, and prosumerism. Now, if everything I just said sounds like Greek to you, or should I say Klingon? But I don't blame you. Let me provide a little more context for you. People have been writing fanfiction on their own for hundreds of years, but fanfiction as we know it today is based largely around the ability to share it with others on the internet and on social media. As fanfiction and shipping, also known as the desire for two characters to get into a relationship, became more and more popular, hitting its peak in the early 2010s, it was clear to see that the most common fanfictions that were written were slash fics. A slash fic is a type or piece of fanfiction involving usually same-sex romantic relationships between fictional characters or famous people, whether or not the romances actually exist. The reasons for this boom in fanfiction, and particularly queer ships during this time, is a loop that feeds endlessly on itself. As queer ships became more popular, the creators of the subject material saw a golden opportunity. They could feed into the queer themes, bringing in more viewers and diehard fans who would create fanfiction and fan art for their media, essentially creating free advertising for their product. As these queer themes intensified, so too did the shipping. As this method, called queerbaiting, began to prove a money-making machine, more and more media objects began to utilize it. However, after fans began to realize that queerbaiting had become this exploitative technique, capitalizing on fan desires for LGBTQ representation without going through with any of it, these pieces of media faced intense backlash, and queerbaiting became less and less common. Fast forward to today, and queer television is at an all-time boom. Heartstopper, Good Omens, Our Flag Means Death, so many extremely popular shows that not only have a queer romance, but center around a queer relationship between the two main characters. But what happened in the time in between? There's a small period of time where these queer themes had become more normalized so that the showrunners felt comfortable inserting them, but yet these relationships were not originally planned. That was until audiences stepped in. From trending hashtags to fanfiction to fan art, audiences made it clear that not only were they recognizing queerness in certain supposedly platonic relationships, but that they were in search of real, canon LGBT themes in their favorite shows. And somehow, the audience's cries worked. In this video essay, I'll be discussing the impact that audiences have had on media, particularly queer-coded media, becoming prosumers and having their voices heard by companies, showrunners, and studios. Through this process, I'll be looking at specific instances where this has happened and analyze what happened when these shows implemented queer relationships that weren't originally planned when the show began. This is all to answer the age-old question, why? Why have audiences started to become prosumers more recently? Why is it happening with specific shows or fandoms more than others? And, maybe most importantly, why is it working? In order to answer these questions, I'll be utilizing two very different shows that decided to do this. One being Fox's Gotham, and the other being Cartoon Network's Adventure Time. Both started their shows during the peak of the queerbaiting years, 2010 to 2014, with little to no LGBTQ themes to be seen. But, as time went on, their audiences began noticing chemistry between characters of the same sex. And that can only end in one way. Thousands of tweets, hashtags trending, fanfictions, fan art, edits, cosplay, and more. Let's introduce these shows a little bit. Gotham is a show about the backstory of Batman that begins right after Bruce Wayne's parents are murdered. Where most Batman stories then skip forward around 20 years, Gotham follows 8-year-old Bruce Wayne as he learns to navigate his new life. Gotham similarly works to establish the backstory of many Batman regulars, notably Jim Gordon, Alfred Pennyworth, Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, and Edward Nygma, aka the Riddler. These two are the ones who began getting shipped, earning them maybe the worst ship name of all time, Nygmobblepot. Hey, don't blame the fans. This was all the Riddler's actor, Corey Michael Smith's doing. Oswald and Edward were being developed in separate storylines, not interacting much, if at all. However, one small interaction in season 1 immediately got audiences excited about their on-screen chemistry, and imaginations began running wild. This only amplified when, in season 2, the two run into one another and Edward begins housing Oswald in his home, meaning the two spent a lot more time together on screen, and their so-called friendship began to seem like a little bit more. Quick sidebar, if any of what I'm saying about the plot seems vague or glossed over, it's because it is. I don't have time to explain that Oswald had just become the self-described king of Gotham after killing his former mentor, the star of Scream 2, Jada Pinkett Smith, and brainwashing his right-hand man, who coincidentally now only has his right hand, only to be betrayed by said right-hand man, his femme fatale girlfriend, and her sociopathic mayor brother when they kill his mother Gertrude in front of him, and he has to hide out in a trailer in the woods to recover from his injuries, where Edward discovers him because he's bearing the body of his girlfriend that he accidentally murdered by asphyxiation after she freaked out because he told her that he purposefully murdered her abusive ex-boyfriend to protect her, and then his alter ego, the Riddler, cuts up her body parts and hides them in various places in the Gotham City Police Department, where Edward works as a forensic science technician, and taunts Edward through hallucinations while forcing him to solve riddles to find her body parts before any of the other police officers do. And this is long before the show jumped the shark. Gotham is insane. So forgive me if I oversimplify any details. Moving to the complete other side of the spectrum tonally, Adventure Time is a show about Jake the dog and Finn the human who live in the magical land of Ooh, filled with kingdoms of candy people, ice, fire, and lumps. Finn and Jake go on various adventures throughout these kingdoms and many, many more, encountering a vast and rich cast of characters, many of whom they befriend, from living video game consoles to elephants who love apple pie, and others who they don't exactly get along with. Unacceptable! Two of the most prevalent reoccurring friends of Finn and Jake are Princess Bubblegum and Marceline the Vampire Queen. Both were introduced very early in the show, but it took a while for them to be seen on screen together. However, that didn't stop the fans, who had begun shipping Bubbline months before they even acknowledged one another in the show. This is most likely due to the idea of opposites attract, since the characters look so visually different from one another. But once they began being in episodes together, it was clear that there was more there, and audiences loved it. Despite the different themes, mediums, tones, studios, and target audiences of these two shows, they each developed a large queer fan base that was the cause of these ships becoming incredibly popular. These fan bases became prosumers and pushed the shows to implement Nick Mobblepot and Bubbline in reality. But how did this work? To start off, the phenomena of being a prosumer or producer-consumer, meaning that they are a prospective customer who is involved in the design, manufacture, or development of a product or service, is not something that only occurs in media. Far from it, actually. Nicole Bozzetto-Moore writes deeply about prosumerism for the Informing Science Institute, noting that tech companies have been one of the largest markets for utilizing this tactic. Companies like Dell have introduced different ways for consumers to give suggestions about product development and changes that could be implemented in future technologies. Bozzetto-Moore attributes this all to the rise of social media, saying that social media is, quote, engendering the birth of the social customer, the embodiment of the prosumer, who uses social networking sites as vital information resources for the sharing and consumption of product and brand information, end quote. Coming to the conclusion that, quote, the growth of social media usage has created the ideal conditions to support the growth and expansion of prosumerism, end quote. However, this explanation doesn't cover the elements of the prosumerism being around queerness and fandom, as this is a relatively new phenomena, while social media has been around since the early 2000s. This is where Anne-Marie Navarre-Gill and Mel Stanfield fill in the gap in their article, We Shouldn't Have to Trend to Make You Listen, Queer Hashtag Campaigns as Production Interventions. This article talks at length about how queer fans have been using social media to have their voices heard, protesting show cancellations, character deaths, and yes, lack of representation. One of Navarre-Gill and Stanfield's points as to why this is happening now as opposed to in the past is due to a cultural shift in public perception of fandom. They write, quote, historically, there was much stigma around being a fan. This has, at least to an extent, diminished in the internet era. In part due to that stigma, fans tended not to address industry even insofar as that was possible technologically at the time. That is, on top of industry not seeking out fans or their opinions, fans were not seeking out industry, and in some cases were actively hiding. Now, there is a sense of a right to be heard, end quote. This helps to explain why this prosumerism push is happening in the current day and age as opposed to years before it. The same can be said of being openly supportive of LGBTQ relationships, as that was not something that was common in the early 2000s in the slightest. This combination is something that Alexis Lothian, Christina Boos, and Robin Ann Reed discuss in their article Yearning Void and Infinite Potential, Online/Fandom as Queer Female Space. They describe the change in being open about being in the slash or queer shipping community when they say, quote, through conventions and fanzines, a distinct community was built around the creation of stories, art, and later videos featuring favorite characters. Often ostracized and ridiculed for their seemingly aggressive interpretations, slash fans developed their own communities. The growth of the internet made it easier for fans to connect, end quote. So, as cultural norms shifted, queer fans became much more willing to be out and proud about their personality and opinions. After all, who else is going to write that Lightning McQueen x Sonic the Hedgehog fanfiction that you've been craving? While I agree with all of these points on a general basis, I still feel like I haven't found my answer as to why certain shows received an influx of prosumers that, based on the size of their fan bases, proportionally outnumbered other shows and led to the show implementing these queer themes that were so vocally desired. Keep in mind, LGBTQ issues were a hot topic during this time period. Gay marriage wasn't legalized in every state, and even showing two characters of the same sex holding hands could get your episode or entire show banned in other countries. It was a big risk for studios to implement queerness into their shows. So, why? Well, to answer the second question, it goes back to the same reason all big businesses do what they do.
I like money.
After all, the entire practice of queerbaiting is based around getting specifically LGBTQ audiences to watch and continue watching shows. We Shouldn't Have to Trend to Make You Listen discusses this point as well, saying, quote, LGBTQ plus folks are a valued market. This marks a critical shift since pursuing that market would not have made business sense in previous eras. This increased market power is vital to how queer fans confront industry because they often explicitly frame themselves in economic terms as a group whose business should be cultivated, end quote. So, with the rewards outweighing the risks and the added benefit of allowing the studio to seem woke, more queer themes began to be allowed to be implemented into shows. However, it seemed that this would only happen if the show knew it was something that the audience wanted and would continue to spread the show through word of mouth for, which is why these prosumerism tactics worked in these specific instances. But, going back to the first point, why did the fans flock to particular shows like Gotham and Adventure Time? Why did these specific shows bring so much demand? I think it all has to do with their social media engagement. The biggest thing that catapulted Nick Mobblepot into the forefront was Edward's actor, Corey Michael Smith, quote tweeting a fan about it. Some of the things that poured the most fuel on the fire of the ship were the various edits and tweets put out by the official Gotham account using the hashtag NigMobblepot, a blatant acknowledgement of the fans' belief in and support for the ship. And the reasons the fans fed into it is because the Gotham social accounts were incredibly personable with them. This wasn't just things like Fan Art Fridays, which isn't rare for shows to do, but what is rare is the sheer amount of tweets, replies, quotes, and follows that the Gotham account gave to random fans. To put it in perspective, let's compare Gotham's Twitter account to that of the TV show Arrow's account. When you compare the two shows to one another, they're very similar. Both Gotham and Arrow are superhero origin shows airing during the same time period. They should have similar demographics, similar followings, and most likely, similar social media strategies. When you compare the accounts, there are two major differences to keep in mind. One, despite Gotham having almost twice the average viewership, Arrow has a much larger social media following, having 2 million followers to Gotham's less than 500,000. And two, Arrow ran for 2 more years than Gotham and 3 more seasons. So, when you put this together, Arrow should probably have more posts than Gotham, right? So, that's slightly different. Let's look at how many accounts they're following. Surely those are... So, yeah. The Gotham Twitter account would do this thing all the time where they'd post, retweet this and we may give you a follow, and they did. Not to brag, but I'm one of the 1,006 people Gotham is following, no big deal. They'd also reply to so many posts that either tag them directly or use the hashtag Gotham tweet, which made people engage with their show more through social media. People would live tweet the show, tag Gotham and everything, make content for it, all in the hopes of getting the Gotham account to notice them. And as people shipped Nick Mobblepot, they tweeted at the account. And clearly, the account noticed. On Season 3, Episode 6, after many storylines, Arkham breakouts, and interactions that seemed a little too touchy to be platonic, Gotham confirms that Oswald had feelings for Edward. And then, to make an incredibly long story short, they give Edward an ex machina girlfriend right before Oswald confesses his feelings, and then Oswald kills said girlfriend out of jealousy, and Edward and Oswald then become bitter rivals in order for Gotham to make sure they didn't spend any more time together on screen. Great job, Gotham! You really did amazing avoiding that pesky LGBT storyline. Moving on to Adventure Time and Bubbling, this is another case in which the social media presence of both the show and the fans made the shift happen. At the beginning, Bubbling was definitely not planned. In fact, it was even censored for a bit, the higher-ups not allowing the two characters to interact anymore because of the queer messages the audiences were perceiving. The reason for this censorship was all because of a recap promotional video series called Mathematical that was posted after every episode on YouTube and various semi-official blogs. The reason I say semi-official is because Mathematical was produced on the behalf of Frederator, the production company that created Adventure Time. No one officially involved in the show was part of making these episodes, but by being under the Frederator name, the show had more weight to it than other fan-run recap shows. The first time that a more overt relationship between Marceline and Bubblegum was hinted at was during the Season 3, Episode 10 episode, What Was Missing? And in the Mathematical episode, the creators made it seem like this was more than just subtext.
What do you think about Marceline and Bubblegum getting together? Does that leave Finn out in the dust, or is it just adorbs? Tell us what you think by commenting or leaving a voicemail at 917-408-FRED!
The decision to put out this recap episode led to an allegedly huge backlash from Cartoon Network. The episode was taken down, and various people involved with both Mathematical and Adventure Time were forced to make responses. The CEO of Frederator, Fred Siebert, posted on the official Frederator Tumblr account, saying, quote, "Well, I completely screwed up. In trying to get the show's audience involved, we got wrapped up by both fan conjecture and spicy fan art and went a little too far. I let us goof in a staggering way, and I'm deeply sorry it's become such a distraction for so many people." This backlash from the studio led to Mathematical being cancelled and Dan Rickmers, the producer of the show, to be fired from Frederator Studios. After this situation, it took almost 2 years for the two characters to be featured prominently in the same episode again. From there, though, the themes only became stronger and stronger as Bubbling went from rivals to ex-friends to good terms to best friends. But finally, after 7 years of slow burn pining and blushing, in the finale of Adventure Time, we got this moment.
I don't want to lose you again.
Hey, I'm a tough gum. Nothing never happening to me. Never.
I know, Girl, you phrased that so weird.
I might have a concussion.
This was the buildup of so much time and felt like the start of something, even though Adventure Time was ending. Now, though, we have limited series and spin-offs where their relationship and their gender-bent counterparts' relationship is stated outright from the jump. Fortunately, we are now in a time period where this can happen frequently and without much stress. But, as we've established, this really didn't happen in the 2010s without the input of the audience. And the audience didn't push it as much unless they felt that their voices were being heard from official show-sponsored social media. As a storyboarder for Adventure Time, Alan Muto pointed out after the Mathematical situation, quote, "If it was just a fan video, there would be no problem at all. The problem was that it was made by a production company actively involved with the show. The video took something that was a possible subtext and declared it, in effect, text, and made it seem like the production was actively seeking out input on plot development." End quote. This is exactly why both Gotham and Adventure Time had these occurrences happen. Their direct interaction with the audience led to these parasocial relationships, with fans subconsciously feeling that they had a personal connection to a show beyond the typical consumer-creator bond. And with the benefits that had been shown from maintaining an LGBTQ fan base of prosumers, the shows listened. So, what do we take away from all of this? Is it that shows should stop interacting with their fan bases for fear of crossing the parasocial prosumer line? No, of course not. As we've seen, burgeoning a relationship with your audience is a great way to not only make them feel heard, but to create a community around your show and increase engagement and interest with your media. I think the issues with Gotham and Adventure Time can stem back to one thing: making promises they couldn't keep. In the end, despite everything they said and all the messages they pushed, Gotham didn't put Edward and Oswald in a relationship. And while Adventure Time did, it took them years and years. They shouldn't have given audiences false hope if there wasn't anything they could follow through with. And in the end, is that any better than queerbaiting? I think there's a point where shows need to put up a boundary between them and their audience. Take, for example, a show I've mentioned before, Good Omens. Good Omens has one of the best social media campaigns I've ever seen, that not only interacts with fans constantly on their official Twitter pages, but allows Neil Gaiman, the creator of Good Omens, to answer tons and tons of fan questions on his Tumblr. The difference? Gaiman has stated explicitly many, many times that he'll never take inspiration from fans. But he doesn't need to, because Good Omens has been very plainly queer from the start. In both the case of Gotham and Adventure Time, the partial confirmation of the characters' feelings didn't lead to them getting more time together on screen. Actually, the exact opposite. In the end, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Queer representation is not only extremely desired, but extremely important. Michael Morgan, a former professor at UMass Amherst, stated, quote, "When you don't see people like yourself, the message is, you're invisible. The message is, you don't count. And the message is, there's something wrong with me." Over and over and over, week after week, month after month, year after year, it sends a very clear message. For years, queer people have been scouring media, looking for any small reference or theme that a character in their favorite show might be just a little bit like them. And while that's getting better, there's still a ways to go. No show should ever get to the point where this kind of representation isn't just desired, it's demanded. Because that only happens after queerbaiting, parasocial bonds, and maybe just a few too many lingering glances. Thanks for watching.